last week. I'm so glad to see so many of you coming and joining us again today. I'm Miriam Marrero, president of the Friends, and we're so happy and proud to be able to present Laura again in with this program on Jacob Lawrence. And we've been so delighted to offer all these programs to you. I can't believe we're at the end of our series of 3. We'll have to do something again later on. But we've been so glad to do this in collaboration with the Moffat Library. And I want to at this point thank David Sadoff for helping us set this all up and Ruth Mannion for helping us to organize these programs. And at that point, I'm going to turn it over to Ruth to introduce Laura. Thank you.
Well, once again, we're welcoming Laura back. For these cultural programs sponsored by the Friends of the Moffat Library. Laura's previous presentations on the artists Winslow Homer and Edward Hopper were a welcome way for us to all get together during this time of isolation. It's really been a treat, Laura, to see these beautiful works of art when we've been so homebound. Laura's no stranger to the Moffat Library. In addition to these recent enlightening lectures, she was the art historian we called upon to present a program on Louis Comfort Tiffany and specifically provide us with background concerning the Moffat's own Tiffany windows. She's a retired educator who has taught all aspects of the visual arts and art history at all levels. Those of us who have attended Laura's many classes at the Desmond Center know Laura as a knowledgeable, thorough, and engaging teacher. She's also a docent at the Storm King Art Center. As a way to celebrate Black History Month, Laura will be speaking today about the Black artist Jacob Lawrence. His work is not only engaging visually, but documents the Black experience in America. And recently, some of you may know that the Metropolitan Museum of Art had an exhibit of Lawrence's work. And an extraordinary thing happened, which I wanted to mention in connection with that exhibit. In the 1950s and early 1960s, Lawrence did a series of 30 paintings entitled Struggle. I don't know if Laura's going to be talking about that at all. But the Met gathered many of these paintings for this recent exhibit, but 5 paintings were missing and blank spaces were left on the wall to show that a painting should be there. A visitor to the exhibit realized that friends of hers living in Manhattan might have one of the missing paintings. She contacted her friends to inform them that the painting that was hanging in their apartment for so many years might be a famous Jacob Lawrence work. And guess what? Yes, it was. So the couple had purchased the painting for a very modest price in 1960 at a benefit for a music school. Some of you may have on your own gone to some of these auctions, you know, where you buy things. Well, they bought a Jacob Lawrence, lucky for them. The painting was brought to the museum and was number 16 in the series. So Laura, we're looking forward to learning about this special artist. So we're ready for you. I think everybody has to mute themselves now, please.
Okay. Okay, can you all hear me and see me? Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to bounce right off of Ruth's lovely introduction. Thank you very much. And I'm on the screen, what you see is panel 16. The missing painting that the couple had in their living room for the past since 1960. And just again, to bounce off what Ruth said, is that this particular painting, it's called, there are combustibles in every state, which a spark might set fire to, Washington, 26 December 1786. Of this series of paintings, when Jacob Lawrence did these 30 paintings called the Struggle Series, he did not sell them to a museum or collection, but he sold them to a private collector whose name was William Myers. And the interest in that is because it was sold to a private collector, he was also able to sell the pieces separately. So that's why they weren't kept as a full series. So we'll look at a couple of these images later, but this kind of sets you up for some of the types of or the style of imagery that Jacob Lawrence used in his works during his career. I'm starting off also with this series, and it also deals with the migration or immigration series that was at the turn of the 20th century. And many of the rugged painters of the 20th century that focused on raw and city life were known as the Ashcan School painters, but they focused on immigration of Europeans and their immigration to Lower Manhattan in particular, was the focus of many of their compositions, not so the African-American artists. But what we're going to start with here also is the idea of the Great Migration. And the Great Migration refers to a movement of 6 million African Americans out of the rural southern United States between about 1900, particularly 1915, 1960 to 1970. And it refers to the idea that by the end of the Great Migration in 1970, 50% of African Americans remained in the South, and 50% of African American population moved up to the northern rural areas. And there was two phases. The first Great Migration, 1916 to 1940, 1.6 million African Americans moved from the mostly rural areas of the South to the industrial North, seeking a better life, seeking for better economic opportunities, and escaping the dominant racism and poverty that they found in the South. The second wave of the Great Migration, 1940 to 1970, was after the Depression, after World War II, pretty much after World War II, and that was called the Great New Migration. The reason I put that in is that it really structured much of Jacob Lawrence's his later career and how he looked at the African American experience, particularly in the North. They did, the African Americans did, when they moved to the North, they did find the adjustment to urban life not very easy. There was overcrowding. They did not have the experience of living in an urban environment. Housing was scarce, unsanitary. There was new forms of discrimination, very many disappointments in their life. And in the North, what happened is, and similar to European immigrations in the 19th and 20th centuries, single family members would move and then kind of bring in their family or hope to bring up family members so they can settle into the urban areas. And so we see, and it's very well documented, we see movements of families from very, very poor rural areas and to movements into the North, Chicago, St. Louis, New York City, Philadelphia, and in particular when the African Americans moved to Harlem and settled in Harlem, there was the birth of a very cultural community. So this brings us to Jacob Lawrence. Jacob Lawrence was his early life, he was born to parents who were from the rural South, rural Alabama. They moved north, they were domestic workers. They moved north and first settled in Atlantic City, where Jacob Lawrence was born in 1917. He was the oldest of 3 children. And they moved about 1915, 1916. And when they moved, and if you see the image at the top left, that's Jacob Lawrence's mother and his siblings there as well. When they moved to the North, his parents were together. They lived in rural Pennsylvania, and then Atlantic City, and then moved to Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia is when his parents separated. And because of that, it was a very difficult situation for his mother. His mother had to set the 3 children into foster homes in Philadelphia, which was a very difficult situation. So his mom made some very wise moves, and she was able to move to Harlem, where at 13, Jacob Lawrence was 13, Jacob Lawrence and his siblings joined in Harlem in 1930. His mother continued to work as a domestic, and and Jacob Lawrence said that when he came to New York City, he found New York City as a young child. He found New York City as a city of contrast, which was totally different than Philadelphia, and also very, very different from Atlantic City and the times that he, the times that he knew during his early childhood. He was, was enrolled in school. He balanced his schoolwork as a delivery boy. He did not make it through high school. However, what his mother did was when he was about 13 years old, his mother enrolled him in an after-school program in the Utopia House. And he became a regular. The Utopia House was started in the mid-20s, and that's at the lower left there. And the Utopia House was started for children that parents work, so it allowed them to have meals, and it also allowed them to have a lot of training in arts and crafts, arts and crafts situations. And they were able to have a well-defined childhood in the Utopia House. The interesting thing about the Utopia House is that it provided for in not only the activities, but it also provided for free lunch and for children of working parents, particularly working mothers. It was located on 170 West 130th Street in Central Harlem, and at this point, and you can notice there's just little images of Harlem there. Harlem in from the mid-20s and 1930s was noted to be a rising area of that was heralded, and this is very derogatory. It was heralded in the New York Herald Tribune in 1934, quote, tenanted exclusively by Negroes. Can you hear me? Okay, exclusively by Negroes. Half the tenants are on relief, and they spend their nights rolling in dreary entranceways. However, James Weldon Johnson, who was a major educator in 1925, contrasted this and said Harlem was a great mecca for the ambitious and talented of the Negro world. It is not merely a Negro colony or community. It is a city within a city, the great Negro city of the world. It is not a quarter of dilapidated tenements, but it is made up of new, in-law apartments and handsome dwellings and well-paved, well-lit streets. So James Weldon Johnson, who you'll see in a few seconds there, James Weldon Johnson was the face of the positive face of the African-American community in Harlem itself. When Jacob was a young child and he was enrolled in the Utopia House, one of the tutors that he had was a man called Charles Alston. Charles Alston was a recent graduate of Columbia College, and he trained as a teacher, but he also trained as an artist. And he got his, he was working in, at the Utopia House, and he experienced a very young Jacob Lawrence. And by this time, Jacob was maybe 13, 14 years old. And he often said that he would leave Jacob alone because Jacob was like a sponge. He would give him materials, and Jacob would knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he would create things out of nothing. Now, at this point in time, as a young adolescent, his education was Jacob's education was very meager, and he didn't have any experience of the African experience of his heritage. He didn't have any artistic experience, but he had a creative experience in order to create. And so Charles Alston recognized this in a young student and basically left him alone all the while Alston was pursuing his own artistic pursuits there. And I'll show you here. Oh, okay. They're also in the Harlem Community Center. These images are very wonderful because it shows a very young, perhaps late adolescent Jacob Lawrence in the white sweater, and you see him working and also working with fellow students, but working on various activities. He loved printmaking, he loved drawing, he loved sculpture. It's said that during his late adolescent years, he would build these dioramas, these empty box dioramas, and he would take them out to the streets and the corners of the streets where he knew in Harlem that he knew the best. And then he would put himself in them, or basically he would create the series, the scenario within the boxes themselves, because he pictured himself as he was living in the city there. At that time in 1936, and mind you now, a young Jacob Lawrence is 17 or 18 years old, Charles Alston had gotten a commission to create a series of murals for Harlem Hospital. And so the two main murals, one was traditional medicine on the left and one was modern medicine on the right. The hospital has since been renovated. And if you look at the lower image there, that's how the murals have been repositioned within the main hospital itself to a tune of $4 million there. In the traditional medicine there, many of the traditional medicine of the African community there were portrayed, as well as the images, and as well as the ancestral images, and as well as the symbolic images of juxtaposed into modern medicine. On the right-hand side, modern medicine was portrayed with fathers of ancient medicine and medicinal equipment, as well as nurses and doctors working on the patients itself. So that was one of his primary instructors. The other important thing that Charles Alston instilled in his students, in particular Jacob Lawrence, and this is primarily a strong focus for Lawrence, was to go to the library, which was at 135th Street, and which is now, I think, incorporated into the Schomburg Library, and to go to the Metropolitan Museum downtown. And it was at the Metropolitan Museum that Jacob Lawrence saw examples of early Renaissance painting in a mural style. And by that I mean narrative paintings, biblical imagery, telling stories in a very visual way, in flat imagery and colorful imagery, but they read as books. So in the top painting, it's reading from left to right, and the bottom painting is the entrance into Jerusalem there. But there were images that, if you know, and as early Renaissance painting did, was it appealed to the non-literate class through visual imagery, so that people who would hear a story or would recognize a story would be able to read visually a story by looking at the image. And that was the importance of that for him. And then in the library, and the research library, learning about his ancestry, learning about history. Lawrence once said that one of his great interests was history, but he recalled that going to school in the public schools, particularly in New York City, they didn't teach African American history. They didn't teach Negro history. They taught white European history. And so, for a very curious young man, the study of history with regards to the African American or the African experience was very important to him. So the earliest images that he did, I haven't been able to find any, but many of the earliest images that he did were related to life in Harlem as he knew it. By the mid-1930s, Lawrence was able to take a studio with Charles Alston, one of his mentors, and the studio was a very tiny studio, but it was a studio nonetheless. No heat, no water, but it was a space where he could do his work. And he began to create images, and again, about life in Harlem in very flat, in a very flat pictorial style. So you were able to read the images, and if you look at the top one next to the black and white photo there, it's life inside of an apartment, cleaning the apartment, sitting at the table, life, domestic, working working within the apartment itself. Lower left is life on the street with the peddler, and then life in the hospital there. So the paintings then reflected for him what he saw in his going going around where he lived, and how he portrayed those images visually, how he portrayed the narrative in a visual sort of way. Here you have two images. One is the home birth in the apartment, and the other one is the blind beggars. And again, you see imagery that are visual, that are done in flat shapes, that have a story that is being told, and in a very modern and abstract way. I put this up here because Lawrence's second major influence, particularly at an early age, was a woman called Augustus Savage. And Augustus Savage has an interesting story in her own right. She was African-American. She was born in Florida. She was very skilled in sculpture, and she was denied many opportunities because of her, her being Black. She had won a scholarship to study in Paris that was denied to her after she was, it was found out that she was a young Black woman. But she was very persistent, and she wrote to Du Bois in Harlem, and she wrote to several people who eventually, she was able to eventually get to study in Paris. I bring her in because in 1937, Jacob Lawrence, again, is maybe 20 years old, and he's studying, having a little art instruction with Augustus Savage. But in 1939, in the World's Fair in New York, several Negro artists were invited to portray, or invited to create sculptures for the World's Fair. And Augustus Savage, who had previously been commissioned to create a sculpture of James Weldon Johnson, the educator who proponed, or who highlighted the life in Harlem in the 1920s. Her sculpture is down on the lower left. She created a sculpture on Weldon Johnson's song, "Lift Up Every Voice and Sing." And it had a major place outside in the World Series complex there. It was more than life-size. You could see her working on the sculpture as well. And the unfortunate part with all of these sculptures is that when the World's Fair was finished, the sculptures was destroyed, or all of the sculptures were destroyed, because they weren't meant to be permanent. But it's between Charles Alston and Augustus Savage, these two major artisans of Harlem artisans that greatly influenced a very early budding career of Jacob Lawrence himself. So much so that he created his first mural series. And the mural series was the life of Toussaint Louverture, and created between 1936 and 1939. And it's 41 paintings, fairly small paintings, that documented the life of Toussaint Louverture, who was a former slave. He turned leader. He led the fight to liberate Saint-Domingue from the French colonial rule and emancipate the slaves in 1791 in the Haitian Revolution. And it was the first successful campaign to abolish slavery, in first campaign in modern history to abolish slavery. And so his series documented Louverture, and again, very much in the style that he was working in the 1930s, very simple images, all with simple passages, or simple sentences, in order to create the narrative that accompanies the picture. The second series was the Harriet Tubman series, created in 1940. And I think there was maybe 10, I'm not exactly remembering the correct number, but in this series, Harriet Tubman in the top there worked as a water girl to with the field hands. She worked at plowing and carting, and she was eventually beaten at 25 years old. And she was moved to plan. It was time for her escape, and she was alone. And so in the right-hand painting there, the caption that goes with this is, she turned her eyes or her face to the North Star, and fixed her eyes on the guiding star, and started her long journey north. And again, you see the similarity of images, very powerful images that tell a narrative through the documentation of the images itself there. Okay, in 1940, okay, let me just get back there for a second. In 1938, after he created these series, Lawrence was given his first solo show at the Harlem YMCA. And it was at that point he started working for the WPA, the Federal Art Project. He received a grant through that from the Rosenwald Foundation. And that grant allowed him to start to create a series of 60 panels that documented the Great Migration, and it was known as the Migration Series. So this grant in 1940 allowed him to rent a studio pretty much on his own, a studio that was big enough to lay out these panels so that he can prepare and work on them simultaneously. And but it was at this point he had met and married a woman called Gwendolyn Knight, who was also an artist. But Gwendolyn Knight helped him prepare the panels and helped him with the narrative captions that he created from his initial research that he had done in the library and through oral history. And so on these panels, he drew out all of the 60 compositions simultaneously. He painted the series all at once. And what that means is that he went from panel to panel. If he mixed up a color, he went from panel to panel and was able to apply the color to each panel, so that there would be a continuity, not only in the narrative, but there would be a continuity in the colorations and the way that the story was being painted. He was 24 years old at this point in time. The Migration Series documented the flight of the millions of African Americans to the North. They blend in a mural format, which he would have seen as a younger student when he went to the Met and witnessed these early Renaissance mural paintings there. But he documented in mural form social realism through modern abstraction. Eventually I'm going to take you through some of these, but eventually this is what launched his career, because the series was purchased jointly by the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. and Museum of Modern Art. So they were, originally, so that kept the series together, not like the Struggle series, which was purchased by an independent or private collector there. But so he found through this series, he found a way to tell his own story, or the story of the plight of the African Americans or the black citizens of the United States in the Great Migration. And through powerful images and vibrancy, he wove together the story almost as if it was from one unit. He said later, to me, the migration means movement. There was conflict, there was struggle, but out of the struggle came a kind of power and beauty. And throughout the series, and particularly towards the end, the refrain goes, and the migrants kept coming. The migrants kept coming. It was a refrain of triumph over adversity. And quote, if it rings true for you today, then it must strike a chord in America. So let me take you through, a couple of these images. I have all of them, but I'll just take them through as they appear on the panel. This is series paintings 1 through 3. At the top one, during the World War, there was a great migration north by Southern Negroes. And the migration, you see where they're going. They're going to the train stations, and they're moving to Chicago, New York, St. Louis, Pennsylvania, and further cities up in the north. The lower left, the World War had caused a great shortage in northern industry, and also citizens of foreign countries were coming home. Well, who was getting the jobs? The citizens that were coming home from the war. And number three, in every town, Negroes were leaving by the hundreds to go north and enter into the northern history and northern industry. In this series here, on the very left, number 4, the Negro was the largest source of labor to be found after all others had been exhausted, particularly those coming home through the war. The Negroes were given free passage, top right, on railroads, which was paid back by northern industry, and so allowing workers to come north to work in the industrial situation. It was an agreement that people brought north on these railroads needed to pay back their passage after they got the jobs. And on the bottom, the trains were packed continually with migrants. This next series here is a bit more abstract. The Negro had been part of the soil for many years, were now living a life in urban centers. So if you look at that, through an abstraction, what you see is agriculturalism. You see a lot of agricultural imagery there. In number 8, they did not, in the middle, they did not always leave because they were promised work in the North. Many of them left because of the Southern working conditions, one of them being the great floods that ruined the crops, and therefore they were unable to make a living. And then on the last panel there, another great ravager of the crops was the boll weevil. Apparently in the early 20th century, there was a great boll weevil infestation that killed off many of the cotton crops there as well. On the top there, number 10, they were very poor. 11, in many places, because of the war, food had doubled in price. So if you see the child and the mother slicing a piece of bread, very, very poor conditions. Number 12, on the right, the railroad stations at the time were so overpacked with people leaving that special guards had to be employed to keep the order. Next panel. Due to the South losing so much of its labor, the crops were left to dry and spoil. That's top left. Top right, among the social conditions that existed, partly was because of the migration, partly because the migration was the injustice done to Negroes in the courts. If you look at the bottom left, there's a tremendous association with the trial of Sacco and Vancetti. And that, again, it was a historical incident that was taking place in the late 1920s. It was social cause taken up by many liberal, particularly literati, were taking up with that, and he compared that to the situation of the course of justice within the African American population itself as well. And we continue on in the next series there. The Negro was used to lynching. He found this an opportune time for him to leave where one had occurred, so leaving to go towards the north. In number 17 on the bottom right, the migration was spurred on by the treatment of the tenant farmers. This whole first half of the series, from about 1 to 30, were about the reasons why the African Americans left the South to begin with, and migration, how it continued in momentum. There was always discrimination, and in the communities of the Negro press was read continually because of the attitude and the encouragement of the movement. And that you can see at the lower right there, the African Americans were encouraged to move north to seek a better life. Up in 21 there, the families arrived at the station in order not to miss the train. The trains were always packed. And then the social causes, bottom left, was one of the social causes of trying to leave was they did not feel safe. It was not the best thing to be found on streets late at night. They were arrested at the slightest provocation. So he's documenting a very, very difficult way of life for Black Americans during this time. And so we continue. I'm just going to move on to continue so you can see, you get an idea, and you can look at them on your own. But again, he tells the story through images, very powerful images of the movement. you know, and how the movement, you know, that when you went north, if you look at the one on the left here, there was a labor agent. He had been sent south by the northern industry in order to, you know, to encourage laborers to come north. And here they're signing their papers. And, you know, they are encouraged to come north to work, but not knowing fully what they're going to find when they come north. And when they come north from 30 on, in every home, people who had not gone north, they decided to, you know, there was a major decision. Should they leave? Should they stay? When they got north, they found, as you see in the lower left, a totally different urban situation from what they left in the south. And they lived stacked upon stacked, you know, of each other in these, you know, these very tall, packed buildings. They tried to find work. They found work in industrial situations, and you know, the life continues on there. So let me just go through, because there is much more here. And if you see on the right there, and panel 42, you see also the discrimination and the hardness that they felt there as well. They also found it very difficult for many migrants to leave the South. They went to railroad stations, you know, the law enforcement went to railroad stations, arrested the Negroes wholesale, and made them miss their trains. So as this was going on, you know, a lot of the labor force was leaving the South to go to the North. And then again, you know, food was scarce. Bottom right, when the families had an opportunity to celebrate, and how did they celebrate? Bottom right, they celebrated as they always celebrated, with family meal, family togetherness, even in, you know, even in an industrial situation. Life was poor, life was quiet. And again, by you know, finding in the cities in the North, they found they had been overcrowded. They found, if you look on the left, they found separation and discrimination there as well. The separation there, in the middle there, number 50, you know, there was strikes, there was strike breakers, and so there was a lot of unrest there as well, strike breakers as well. But they, you know, they continued, you know, on the right here, one of the main forms of social and recreational activities which the migrants indulged in occurred in church. And I just started watching this last night, and it was on the Black Church on PBS. And there's a wonderful series that's being presented, and how important the church was to community, how important was music to the community. And here it's being, you know, he's documenting it in a very visual way. Okay, so, you know, this idea of life coming north, life was not what they had, you know, many of them had expected, but yet they came north for education. They came north for a better life, and better educational facilities. And they had on the left panel there, in the North, the Negro had the freedom to vote, and as he, you know, his refrain goes through all of the panels, and the migrants kept coming, Well, what's interesting about this, in addition to MoMA and the Phillips Collection purchasing the whole series, and it's a wealth of beautiful information there, and very difficult situation. But a woman called Edith Halpert in 1941-42 opened up a little gallery in Lower Manhattan called the Downtown Gallery, a very tiny little gallery in the Village. And she was the first gallerist to bring Jacob Lawrence in and his artwork, and give him not only the space to show the Migrant series, but she also brought in other 20th century African-American artists that had been struggling for major places to have their work exhibited. So she was very Edith Halpert was very taken with the Migration series, but she also purchased another series. So it was at this point in time, in the early 1940s, before he got World War II there, that he now became a household name, or in the art world. His reputation started to you know, be well known. So, and this is 1941. this is called Bar and Grill, and this is just before his entrance into World War II. When Lawrence married Gwendolyn Knight, they took a 2-year quote honeymoon where they traveled around the South. And as they traveled around the South, New Orleans and Alabama and many of the cities there, I guess, living and working and whatever, he really began to see the discrimination that existed and still existed, very much so in the Southern community. And in Bar and Grill, this is very much a visual documentation of the segregation in a bar and grill, where the bar is populated. There's the barman on the left, and there's a fan for the heat, and the situate, even in abstract terms, the situation is fairly okay. But on the right hand side, silhouetted images, very sparse population, and definitely a visual wall, and that is displayed to show that separation. When he came back to New York, it was back to the library again, and he began another series, or a simple series, about life in Harlem. And again, students in the library, and one of his favorite places was the library, and was the library on 125th Street. And he began, his art started to take a little bit of a different turn as far as his visual imagery, still using the flat shapes, still using decorative pattern, but his narrative was a little bit different. His images of Harlem were, again, very, very modern series. And he shows, life in Harlem. This is Harlem from the rooftops, very busy. He was very, very fascinated with the patterns of the city and the iron fire escapes and their shadows and the brick walls. And remember, when he was a youth, what he did was, this is maybe 15 years after his youth, when he built the dioramas, and he would go to the street corners and he would imagine himself on the street life there as well. So this series, of which they weren't a continuous series, they were just a series of paintings of life in Harlem, where he variegated colors and shapes and patterns and letters, and you could see on the bar and the funeral home, ordinary everyday tasks, events, notations, and he's documenting this in a very, very very modern way. So, talks about bootleg whiskey. You can buy bootleg whiskey for 25 cents. He talked about hot days in New York. He talked about how Harlem life, after he just came home from two years, touring the South again, with his new wife, Gwendolyn Knight. Harlem life was very different than farm life, very small apartments, very vertical living, very densely packed. The sound of nature is replaced by people and traffic and horns, honking horns. In his images of Harlem, he painted his visions of poverty and crime, racial tensions, police brutality, all based on his experience, or as he experienced it to begin with. And here you have some of these very, very brightly colored apartment scenes, domestic scenes, it's the intricacies of life in Harlem itself, where he repeats the geometric shapes and colors, the Christian iconography. Up in the top right, the working, the seamstress, the working, the domestic activities, and he uses one of the things that he uses, and particularly in this series, if you notice, he uses yellow, blue, and red, and he would have seen these colors in stained glass in churches, and that he uses them and he parallels those yellow, blues, and reds in these series of paintings, and he talks about how the social and religious importance of church and community was to the Harlem community during the mid-century there. This is more of the Harlem series, the tombstones, the Church of God, buying whiskey for 25 cents. And again, they're very realistic images of life as he witnessed, but also as he portrayed in the series there. This is Builder in the Pool Halls in the 1940s. Well, in 1946, there was a very important article in Life magazine, which was the major pictorial magazine of up until, I guess, the 1970s and 1980s. 12 Black artists were appeared under the title Negro Artists, Their Works, and the byline of this article was, the paintings and sculptures shown on these pages are interesting, not because they were done by Negroes, but because they represent some of the best work turned out by American artists today. And they highlighted African-American artists of the 20th century, particularly of the 20th century, but one or two of the 19th century there. What they also went on to say, talked about the Harmon Foundation exhibitions in 1928 and 1935, and the WPA, which helped develop Black artists as an artistic, in their own artistic right. But this is another quote from them. They avoided painting Negro subjects because, particularly 19th century African-American and early 20th century African-American artists avoided painting Negro subjects, partly because few people were interested in them. Finally, in the mid-1920s, Negro artists began to paint and write about themselves. Their work began to take on vigor and the validity that it had lacked. So in essence, what they're saying is that for the first time, African-American artists were recognized for the vitality and the vibrancy of their art that had been neglected for so many years. Okay, so in I think it's 1941, Lawrence was, he was, I don't have my notes for this anyway, but he went into the Coast Guard. He was inducted into the Coast Guard. He was, and in the Coast Guard, he was on the first, again, which I don't have my notes here, but anyway, he was labor, but he was in the first Navy ship that had been in a first fully integrated Navy ship during World War II. And his talent was recognized, and he was brought up to the level of, he became a war artist. And what's very interesting about this, as a war artist, he painted very little of actual war scenes. He was supposed to paint, what he was supposed to paint was all the generals and all the commanders and all of the high ranking administration of the military. But what in turn he painted, particularly was on the ship, is he painted the crewmen and the life and the works of the crewmen as he witnessed them in his tenure there with the Navy, the Coast Guard there. Okay, so he got out of he came out of the war. His art style took on yet another change, a different change, still very modernistic. In 1946, he was invited to the Black Mountain College in Asheville, North Carolina. He was invited by a man called Joseph Albers, who again was also who had also fled the Semitism or the anti-Semitism of Europe in mid-century, and he brought on Jacob Lawrence in order to become a teacher. And Lawrence went on to say that Jacob Lawrence went on to say that Joseph Albers made quite an impression upon him because of the simplicity of his artistic style and what he could learn from them himself. It was so important for Albers to get Jacob Lawrence on site at the Black Mountain College that Albers hired a private train car to transport Jacob and his wife Gwen to and from Asheville, North Carolina, so they wouldn't have to be relegated to the, quote, colored section of the train when they reached the Mason-Dixon line. So it was at this point in time he began a pretty active teaching career there. And as I mentioned, Albers was the first person outside of the artistic community or the Black artistic community to have an influence on me. So it was through Albers Lawrence began to understand um, an analytical appreciation of art that he was already using, but he began to understand why he was using it. And so he was, making a two-dimensional picture plane like a three-dimensional picture plane. He was adding more three-dimension into his work, and he was also changing colors and meanings by using them in different forms and organizing movements a bit more into geometric shapes. So unfortunately, in 1949, Lawrence was voluntarily admitted himself for 11 months to Hillside Hospital in Queens because he was suffering from depression, and it was a departure from his previous work there. And so again, he again moved on. Again, his life took a different turn, and his artwork took a different turn. And it was at this point in time in the mid 50s where we started there with the Struggle series, where he created the first panel. It was in the mid 50s there, but the first panel number one of the Struggle series was "Is life so dear, or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery?" And the quote was from Patrick Henry in 1775. This series itself, what he had done is he used the founding fathers, the Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution, and the idea of American democracy to create a series for all Americans. And in this particular panel here, what you see is Patrick Henry, the top man there, pointing forward beyond the crowd, and with a rifle in his hand. And you see below there's three raised fists, and one of them is blocking a woman and a child. They all have an upward attentive gaze, and the painting itself was painted in particular response to the violent murder of a man called Emmett Till in 1955. His funeral was widely attended. There was a trial, there was a protagonism. This began a fight for human freedom. Emmett was a young boy who was abducted and eventually murdered. So the colored panel, or the color choices that he used in this, are very somber earth tones, ochres and blacks, against a field of red. And the red is fire, and the fire is strength and anger. In panel number 6, and then number 29, panel number 6 is "We mutually pledge each other to our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." This is from July 4th, 1776. These are from the final words of the Declaration of Independence: "For a solemn pledge as a bounty and a burden for every American to carry on in a democracy." And the rake, you can see a rake there, and you can see a musket, divides the composition into two halves, and it kind of frames the farmer who's laboring or is working in 1776. He himself carries the burden of the hay, and the hay itself, the hay or the wheat, is a symbol of America's bountiful ideals of freedom, and which became part of the struggle to uphold and defend. In panel 29, which is also another interesting panel, but it's a little bit different: "A cent and a half a mile and a half an hour." This was the slogan of the Erie Canal builders. And so Jacob Lawrence chose to credit and showcase the workers who built the Erie Canal across New York State from 1817 to 1825. And the three figures, if you can look in the center there, there's three figures that shoulder a canal beam that fills the entire composition. And so he utilized the weight of the line, which is the girder up on the top there, to emphasize the physical power of those who labored underneath it. So it's the power of the person, that is, the human spirit, and the power of the person who's underscoring the human capital that was necessary to construct the 363-mile canal system. And again, these images, many of these images came from his own research, and particularly from early paintings and things that he was able to look at during his research. In the 1960s, he went to Nigeria in 1962, an invitation to teach and exhibit his work. And 2 years later, he returned for an 8-month stay and painted aspects of everyday life. And so you notice yet again, his art is influenced by his surroundings and the color and what he appears. This is the street to Mabari. This is very different than the streets of Harlem. And here he captures the hustle and bustle of a street market, outdoor market, and they line the streets all the way from the foreground to the middle ground to the background, and young and old, and you can almost feel the energy within the market itself. So you can feel the energy. You could see the crowds. You can hear the goats bleating. You can see, look in the center for the goats there, the chickens. Everything is happening over there as well. And so he says of this painting, or of his time in Nigeria there, I became so excited then by all the new visual forms I found in Nigeria, the unusual color combinations, the textures, the shapes, the dramatic effect of light, that I felt an overwhelming desire to come back as soon as possible to steep myself in Nigerian culture so that my paintings, if I'm fortunate, might show the influence of the great African artistic tradition. So you look to the colors and the shapes and the movement and all of that. It's a very, very exciting kind of imagery to itself. And again, he painted throughout his career. He painted not in oil, not in watercolor, but he painted in opaque tempera paint, which is almost like a gouache. It's a watercolor paint itself. In 1971, he moved to Seattle, Washington with Gwendolyn. He taught at the university in the art school there. There you see Lawrence in his studio, a second floor studio. He was commissioned. He was commissioned in 1970s to create the Olympic Games stamp, or the Olympic Games poster for the Munich Games there. And so if you look on the left there, you see 5 runners with grimacing faces. You can almost feel their strength there, that take giant strides around a curving track as they head towards the finish line. They hold the batons, which are the small sticks, in their hands because they're competing in a relay race. And each athlete is shown with his arms, legs, and head in different positions. So it's kind of like, okay, who's going to win? It creates that sense of excitement in a very abstract form. And so it's the Olympic Games there. The symbol, the Olympic symbol, the 5 interlocking, forms there as well. He used them within the forms of his shape in the poster itself there as well. And again, these are some series of paintings that he did in the 1970s. Again, very different contemporary issues. And it's called the Builder's Suite from the late 1970s. And his quote, he said, "I like the symbol of the builder. I think of it as a man's aspiration, as a constructive tool. A man is building." And so, again, he still continued to use his limited power palette of the ochres and the blues and the reds. And he juxtaposed the human activity against architectural tools, as you can see up in the top left-hand corner and the middle there, as well as building tools and mats and all of that. So in this series, it really portrays his idea of the American worker culture, including female workers, where the idea of the builder was to include the family as well, and including the African American in the builder's trade. Trade as well. He also completed a series of the John Brown series in the 1970s, and very much the same format. This is called The Swearing In. This is 1977. This has direct reference to President Carter. President Carter said, quote, that he wanted this event to be the people's the people's imagination. My focus was on people watching, not the people up front in the privileged seat, but the people in the back, up in the trees, trying to get a good view. There were people applauding the most. These were the people who were the most important ingredients of the swearing in on the inauguration there as well. So again, you notice his style, again, very simplistic, but yet you get the concept of the the anticipation and the exhilaration of people looking towards perhaps a new future again, as well as the the swearing in of the president there as well. Okay, this is a builder. This is one of his last series, 1985, of 1980s to 80 to 85. He returned in the 1980s. He returned to a theme inspired by his Harlem paintings, and these refer to Harlem cabinet makers and the workshops and the men and women of all races that are working in a very vertical format, building unspecified. It doesn't say what they're building, so they're unspecified architectural structures or monuments, and they're again using flat colors, flat planes of colors, abstract shapes that create the builders, the tools and the structures, building in process. And so, in these images, the foreground and the background kind of work together. But he doesn't tell us what they're building. It's the process of what they're building that was important to him, and the collegial aspect of the building that was important to him. And because he cherished the American worker and how the American community symbolized a universal desire to construct one's own destiny with figures of all races together, creating and building and shaping the space of the surrounding world. So by using simpler colors and looser figures, that you didn't have so much of a demarcation of foreground, middle ground, and background, but you also had a much more freedom in approach there. This is the Schomburg Library in 1986, and again returning to his love of when he was a youth, and the love of study and the love of research, and thinking about thinking about how much he learned coming from a very impoverished situation where he was allowed the freedom, particularly by his mother, and mother recognized, allowed the freedom to create. Charles Alston allowed him the freedom to create, also encouraged him to learn and research throughout his career. And research was always a powerful tool for him. And it was how he translated that research into the images that that portrayed today. This is the 8 studies for the book of Genesis. This is again one of his late series, and a very biblical in formation there, but again in a fairly simple way. This is I don't know what this is. I think it's part of the same series. Oh no, this is the subway mural series. This is a subway mural where it's life in Manhattan there as well. And there you have it. It was translated. That's the painting. It was translated into a mural, 42nd Street and Broadway, into mosaic murals. So that is recognized, which I've never seen actually, but is recognized as a very powerful piece. And again, imagery that is meant to be read. And again, finishing up here, and the migrants kept coming. In 1974, at a Jacob Lawrence retrospective in the Whitney, Milton Brown, who was an art historian, very popular in the 1970s, very renowned, he said, perhaps no other artist of our time has hewn so closely, despite external conditions and personal aesthetic evolution, to his original inspiration and principle. There's something very monolithic about Jacob Lawrence and his work, and it's his undeviating seriousness and commitment to both the social and the Black consciousness, and at the same time to insist on the larger human struggle for freedom and social justice in all the world and for all people. So during his life, Jacob Lawrence, during his life and after his life now, his work is found in, besides private collections, in 200 museums. He's received numerous awards, National Medal for the Arts, NAACP's prestigious Springhorn Medal, 3 Julius Rosenwald fellowships, which, if you recall, in 1940 was the fellowship that allowed him to create the Migration series, 24 honorary degrees from upper educational institutions. He was elected to the Academy of Arts and Letters, which is the highest honor in the artistic community in the United States, and the Black Academy of Arts and Letters, National Academy of Design. He described his work as a continuation as he was constantly growing and building. Jacob Lawrence died at the age of 82 in 2000. There is it's a self-portrait of him that he painted when he was in his Seattle studio. He depicts his face as a mask. He's holding brushes, and that indicates his profession as an artist. He's smiling. He's welcoming us into his space. He's surrounded by the tools of his trade. On the left in the background is one of his paintings from the series of the Juliet Tubman series as well. And so there, my friends, there we have it. So I hope that you have you're able to get a little bit of let's see if we can do this, a little bit of an understanding of the